Hello everyone and welcome to chapter 8.2. This is transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now when we talk about the transport of O2 and CO2, one molecule should come to mind, and that molecule is hemoglobin. It is found in large quantities in red blood cells, and its primary function is to transport both oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we start our story with something we call the hemoglobin dissociation curve. Now what the curve shows is pretty straightforward. The idea is the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, right, the higher the percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. If I were to paraphrase this in layman language, this is what it will sound like. When there is more oxygen, the more it will bind with hemoglobin. That makes sense, right? More oxygen, more it binds with hemoglobin. But this is fancy terms, right? This is what the proper terms are. The hemoglobin dissociation curve is a graph of percentage saturation against partial pressure of oxygen. And as you can see, it is increasing. Now, what is going on here when we talk about high partial pressure of oxygen? When we say high partial pressure of oxygen, we really mean that this occurs at the capillaries in lungs. This is where the partial pressure of oxygen is the highest. There is a high supply of oxygen, and therefore partial pressure of oxygen is high, and therefore hemoglobin would pick up oxygen and become highly saturated with oxygen. What about low partial pressure of oxygen? What location would have a very low partial pressure of oxygen? Think about it. Clearly, respiring tissues would have a very low partial pressure of oxygen because oxygen demand is high for aerobic respiration, right? And therefore, hemoglobin has to carry oxygen to the respiring tissues. When partial pressure of oxygen around the hemoglobin is low, hemoglobin will be able to release that oxygen and become less saturated with oxygen. Therefore, percentage saturation is low. That makes a lot of sense, correct? But one thing may not make sense just yet. Why isn't this curve a straight line? Why is it a curve? Why is it an S-shaped curve? Why is it sigmoidal? Shouldn't it be a straight line? Why is it directly proportional? Now, the reason why it's S-shaped is because hemoglobin exhibits cooperative binding or allosteric effects, meaning that the more oxygen binds to that hemoglobin, the more it will bind to the next oxygen molecule. Okay, so one hemoglobin binds to 4 oxygen molecules, correct? So the first one probably near the hem group, right? Probably at the respiring tissue, the first oxygen that combines with it changes the shape of the hemoglobin a little bit. This makes it have higher affinity towards the second and third oxygen, making the binding of the second and third oxygen molecule easier than the first one. So, a small increase in partial pressure of oxygen would result in a large increase of percentage saturation. So you can see here, the gradient is less steep, but here the gradient is more steep. The increase of percentage saturation is higher. Now, how about the fourth molecule of oxygen? Why does the graph seem to level off? Now, this is because all hem groups are fully occupied, and it's kind of hard for the fourth one to bind, and therefore the gradient of the curve kind of becomes less steep again. And at this point, when it finally binds, hemoglobin is fully saturated, so the curve levels off as well. So yeah, this S shape is basically, again, due to cooperative binding. The second and third molecule of oxygen binds to the hemoglobin easier because the first molecule of oxygen changes the hemoglobin shape. Okay, so you might be asking, why is this important? Why is the shape so important? Now, if you haven't noticed yet, we always link partial pressure of oxygen to the different parts of the body. At the respiring tissue, partial pressure of oxygen is low. Therefore, percentage saturation is low. This is because there's a high oxygen demand for aerobic respiration. When the blood moves from the respiring tissues to the lungs, just a slight increase in partial pressure of oxygen will increase the percentage saturation. So the hemoglobin can pick up oxygen really quickly. Now the reverse is also true. Hemoglobin not only just picks up oxygen quickly and binds to oxygen quickly because of this steep area right here, it also releases oxygen more quickly when the hemoglobin is moving from the lungs to the respiring tissues in those red blood cells. Because as blood travels from the capillaries in the lungs to tissues, right, it's here. As the partial pressure of oxygen decreases, a small decrease in partial pressure of oxygen is going to decrease the percentage saturation of hemoglobin as well, because of, like, again, this steep region right there. And this allows more oxygen to be released to the respiring tissue more quickly. And in the process, this partial pressure of oxygen basically decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. So basically, what we're saying is partial pressure of oxygen can increase the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. The more oxygen there is, the higher the percentage saturation. And the S-shaped curve makes it more efficient. Now, I want to add one more factor to this in the picture. When we talk about respiration, it's not just about oxygen, it's also about carbon dioxide. And this also affects the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide, at high partial pressures of carbon dioxide, this decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. So we can see in this curve right here how high partial pressure of CO2 has shifted the curve to the right. This shift is called the Bohr effect or the Bohr shift. Then you're like, hold on a second, hang on. Why does it shift to the right again? How does this affect again? Okay, let me tell you. So what is the Bohr effect? The Bohr effect is named after this guy, Christian Bohr, who discovered it. And the idea is high partial pressure of CO2 decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. And the reason why the curve shifts to the right is because a higher partial pressure of oxygen is needed to meet the same percentage saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Let's just take this 60%, really badly drawn 60% as an example. To reach this same percentage saturation, you will need only less than 4 kilopascals of oxygen in order to reach this saturation, right? This around 60% saturation. However, at high CO2 concentration, in other words, partial pressure of CO2, you would need a higher partial pressure of oxygen, around 4.5 kilopascals, in order to achieve that same percentage saturation. Because of this, the curve shifts to the right. These two curves here side by side shows that high partial pressure of CO2 decreases the affinity of hemoglobin to oxygen. What do we mean by decreased affinity? The Bohr effect basically increases dissociation of oxyhemoglobin in actively respiring tissues, meaning at high CO2 concentration, oxygen will be released from hemoglobin more readily, especially in actively respiring tissues. You might say, okay, prove it to me. Well, let me prove it to you. Look at this curve right here. Okay, I know my writing is pretty messy. Let me just erase it. This line here is for low partial pressure of CO2. This line here is for high partial pressure of CO2. Now, just like just now, we always refer to the lung and the respiring tissues because that's the end goal, right? We want hemoglobin to pick up oxygen in the lungs and deliver it to the tissues. Lung tissues have a high partial pressure of oxygen, low partial pressure of CO2. And therefore, the section of the curve that's relevant would be here, because in this region, partial pressure of oxygen is high, and it's on the line with for low partial pressure of CO2. How about for respiring tissues? Respiring tissues have lower PO2 and higher PCO2, and therefore the relevant section of the curve would be this one. This line is for high PCO2, and it kind of is in this region where partial pressure of oxygen is low. Now, what does this tell us? This tells us that at the respiring tissue, oxyhemoglobin doesn't only dissociate readily, it dissociates very readily, more readily than expected because of this high partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So therefore, this curve seems to be is lower than the other pink line, right? This is lower. In the lung tissues, it's the opposite. It's true as well. The lung tissues is not only really good, hemoglobin is not only really good at picking up oxygen, it's very, very, very good at picking up oxygen. Again, why? Because not only oxygen is in abundance there, also because there is a low partial pressure of CO2. So yeah, that is why the Bohr effect is so great, okay? And this makes our hemoglobin very, very efficient. Now the question is the mechanism. So we know it happens, but how does CO2 affect oxygen transport? How does carbon dioxide affect oxygen transport? And what is the reasoning behind this curve? What is the specific mechanism? Biologists loves mechanisms, I tell you. And this equation is why. Okay, basically, your red blood cells also transport carbon dioxide, right? So at high partial pressure of carbon dioxide would combine with water, and this reaction is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase, which results in carbonic acid. This CO2 is from respiring tissue, by the way. It diffuses into the blood plasma, which then diffuses in the red blood cells where the hemoglobin is at. In the cytoplasm of the red blood cell, this process happens, converting CO2 to carbonic acid. And this is great because this maintains a steep concentration gradient. Because CO2 is converted, this means there's always a higher concentration of CO2 in the tissues and lower concentration of CO2 in the blood. So, the CO2 will always diffuse from the tissue to the blood. Then this carbonic acid actually dissociate because it's an acid. It dissociate into hydrogen carbonate ions, HCO3 negative, and hydrogen ions. Now, the formation of these hydrogen ions a little bit problematic because it can cause a decrease in pH. So how would the cell cope with this? We'll see it in the next slide, yeah? So, okay, so far we have carbon dioxide and water combining to form carbonic acid, and this is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase. Now, this carbonic acid then dissociates into these two ions, right? Hydrogen ion and hydrogen carbonate ion. This hydrogen carbonate ion, where does it go? It goes out of the cell. It diffuses from the red blood cell into the blood plasma, and CO2 is primarily transported in this form, in this ion in the blood plasma. Okay. Now, however, this means that there'll be a net positive charge because one negative ion has moved out, but hydrogen ion is still inside the cell. So to balance out the negative charge, chloride ions, which are also negative charge, would move into the red blood cell. This movement of chloride ions into the red blood cell is called a chloride shift. And this is really just to cancel out those charges there. Okay, so that's what's happening with the hydrogen carbon ion. What about the hydrogen ion? The hydrogen ion combines with hemoglobin actually. Wow, it forms the hemoglobinic acid. And hemoglobinic acid here is really the star. It is really the answer we're looking for. This is the cause of the Bohr effect. Why? Because, well, hemoglobin actually has a higher affinity for hydrogen ions than oxygen. So because of this equation and this reaction that happens, hydrogen ions are produced, and hydrogen ions would lower the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, resulting in that Bohr shift. Oxygen is then released more easily to the respiring tissue. Now, another great part about hemoglobinic acid is this. It also prevents the pH from decreasing, thus solving our problem of hydrogen ions decreasing pH just now, right? So it acts as a buffer, and by binding the hydrogen ions, those ions do not cause pH to decrease. Anyways, the point is, this is a star. This hemoglobinic acid formation actually causes oxygen to be released from the red blood cell, of course, to the blood plasma, and then this oxygen can then diffuse into the respiring cells. This particular mechanism is also shown in this form very often, especially in exams, and pretty much the same idea here. We have CO2, which was originally from respiring tissue. It diffuses into blood plasma, which then diffuses into the red blood cell. CO2 and H2O combine together, and this forms carbonic acid. And this is catalyzed by carbonic anhydrase. This carbonic acid then dissociates, forming hydrogen carbonate ions as well as hydrogen ions. Hydrogen carbonate ions just diffuse out of the cell into the plasma. This is the form where CO2 is transported, well, 85% of the time. But the movement of this hydrogen carbonate ion out of the cell would cause a chloride shift to balance out the negative charge. Hydrogen ion, on the other hand, binds together with hemoglobin, forming hemoglobinic acid, and that hemoglobin would then release oxygen, which is then diffused out of the cell. It would diffuse out of the plasma into the respiring tissue. So the same process as just now, just in a different diagram. You can pause it and try to process it on your own. You can try and draw it on your own. It'll be really, really helpful. Now, as I said just now, this reaction is why the Bohr shift occurs. This reaction, written in one line like this, is exactly why the Bohr shift occurs, because it produces hydrogen ions, which then combines with hemoglobin, and hemoglobin just happens to have a higher affinity for hydrogen ions than oxygen. So this causes the Bohr effect, Bohr shift, and that's how oxygen is released more easily to respiring tissue, which is what you want, which is what is desired, which is the purpose of hemoglobin. But moving on from transport of oxygen, let's look a little bit at the transport of carbon dioxide. So we have already seen the transport of carbon dioxide, how it's picked up in the respiring tissue, but how is it transported other than this 85% of the time, right? And how is it transported to the lungs? So 85% of the time, as we saw just now, it's hydrogen carbonate ions. This is the form in which carbon dioxide is it's transported, carbonic anhydrase would convert the carbon dioxide to carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates, and then those hydrogen carbonate ions diffuse from the red blood cells into plasma. So this is 85% of the time, like we just mentioned. However, 5% of time, carbon dioxide can dissolve directly into the blood plasma and remain as CO2 molecules in the blood plasma, just a dissolved one. And 10% of time, carbaminohemoglobin can form. CO2 can directly diffuse into a red blood cell and directly bind to the terminal amine of the hemoglobin molecule. Again, the hemoglobin molecule is a protein. It has a quaternary structure. It is made of polypeptide chains. So there is one amine group at the end, which is terminal means N, that is not bound, is not involved in peptide bonding. So carbon dioxide can directly bind to that terminal, the N amine group, and form what we know as carbaminohemoglobin. And carbamino is remembered like this, right? Because it's carbon dioxide, so carb. Amino, because it binds to the amine group, so carbaminohemoglobin is actually a name that makes a lot of sense. Carbon dioxide binding to amino group of hemoglobin. Nice. So yeah, these are the 3 ways carbon dioxide is picked up from the respiring tissues. So you can expect this deoxygenated blood at this point to flow back to the lungs. Now, what happens at the lungs then? How does CO2 get from our bloodstream into the alveoli and out into the atmosphere? Okay, so it's basically the same thing, but in reverse. Why? Now, it's important to come back to this point. In the respiring tissue, the conditions are different from the alveoli in the lungs, right? In the lungs, there is low PCO2 and high PO2. And therefore, all the reactions just now would reverse in direction. Hemoglobinic acid, HHB, would release its hydrogen ions as it binds oxygen, because this is when partial pressure of oxygen is high. It's in the lungs, and this forms oxyhemoglobin. Hydrogen ion would then bind with the hydrogen carbon ions that have diffused back into the red blood cell. This converts it back to carbonic acid, which is then converted back to carbon dioxide and water. And guess what? It's the same enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, which catalyzes the reaction both ways. So this CO2 is then produced, and it can diffuse out of the red blood cell into the alveoli. Of course, hydrogen carbonate ions is only one way of transporting carbon dioxide, which is most of the time, but only one way. The rest of the processes will also reverse. The method number 2, which is dissolve CO2 in the blood plasma, can diffuse into the alveoli as well. And number 3, the CO2 that's binding to the hemoglobin, okay, CO2 from carbaminohemoglobin is going to detach as well and diffuse directly into the alveoli and out of your body as you exhale. Whew, and that is the transport of carbon dioxide from your respiring tissue to your lungs to the outside. Okay, and that's it. That is how the transport of oxygen occurs. That's how the transport of CO2 occurs. It is more intertwined than you realize, and I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it. I'll see you next video. Bye-bye.